Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar presented by Security Management Magazine and Pivot3 on video surveillance, current practice, and future directions. This webinar is based on joint research performed by Security Management and Pivot3. Pivot3 provides the highest levels of performance, resiliency, and availability, so critical video surveillance data is stored without loss, protected from any failures, and always available when and where it is needed. My name is Scott Briscoe. I am Content Development Director for ASIS International, and I will be your moderator today. Those of you who hold an ASIS certification, you can apply 1 hour of CPE credits toward that credential today. You will receive an email a few hours after the event that will serve as documentation that you attended today's event. That email will also contain a link to the archived event, and I encourage you to share that link with your colleagues and your peers and through your social networks. The format of today's session will be a presentation followed by a Q&A. As you have any questions, please use that box on your screen that you see to the left of the slides and submit any questions you have, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Any of the questions that we don't get to, we will try to answer after the event. With that, I would say that we are very fortunate to have as our presenter today Brandon Reich. He's the Vice President of Security and the Internet of Things for Pivot3. In 2016, he was named one of the top 12 influencers in the physical security and video surveillance industry by SecurityWorld. And for Pivot3, he leads all product and go-to-market initiatives, including software-defined storage solutions for enterprise video surveillance and physical security. Brandon, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Scott, and thank you everyone for joining today. As Scott mentioned, I'm Brandon Reich. I lead the video surveillance and this newer practice that we call IoT, or the Internet of Things. And I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about some of the things that are happening in the world of video surveillance, physical security, and this broader IoT or emerging IoT world. As Scott mentioned, we did conduct some research recently with ASIS and Security Management, and we're going to talk about that survey and some of the results that came out of it, which I think you'll find are fairly interesting. And then we're going to go through and talk a little bit about the implications that this is having on you and your organization, and perhaps working with your IT counterparts within your organization and the conflict that can arise from that. We're going to talk about technologies that you have available to you today, as well as emerging technologies that can help you solve some of your challenges in ways that perhaps are a little bit different than what you've seen in the past, what the impact of those technologies are. And then if we have time available, we'll go through a couple of real-world examples, but I want to be sure we leave enough time for us to do some Q&A at the end as well. So let's get started. We all know there are lots of major trends happening in the world of video surveillance and physical security technology today. Now, a lot of these trends to you may sound like a buzzword, but really when they are properly planned, properly deployed, they can really lead to significant value to you and your organization. Now, these are just a few that you've probably heard of in the past year or two, but I want to dig down a little bit deeper into one of the biggest buzzwords, or the biggest trends, I'll say, out there today, which is the Internet of Things, or we know it as IoT. Now, a lot of people look at IoT and they've heard this word before and they say, gosh, I see it all over the place now, everything from a video surveillance camera to my car that is connected to the internet, my refrigerator at home that's connected. What is IoT? What does that actually mean? Well, when we look at IoT, what we say, the way we define it is, IoT is really the ability to transform data that's being generated by millions and millions of sensors into some kind of actionable intelligence. Now, believe it or not, video surveillance is actually and has been at the forefront of this revolution that's occurring in IoT. In fact, video surveillance really has been for years. Even though we didn't necessarily call it IoT in the past, Video surveillance cameras for years have been connected to a network, to the internet, to a private network somehow, generating data that can be used in some form for some form of intelligence. But recent advancements in this technology, new use cases, new uses of the technology, combined with declining costs of all that technology, are really driving the demand for video surveillance to almost unforeseen levels. And I'll show you some of that here in just a few minutes. So as a result of that, we're seeing increasingly video moving more into the IT realm, into the data center, which brings with it new expectations from our IT departments, new people that we have to deal with, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on here. But first, let's look at some of the projections out there. Some of these you've probably seen, some of it you may not have. On the left-hand side of your screen, what you see there is that this year, in 2019, IHS predicts that over 100 million new IP video surveillance cameras will be deployed. Now, what this bar doesn't necessarily tell you is that the resolution of those cameras are also increasing, the average resolution. And that ties back to exactly how much data is being generated by those cameras. So on the right-hand side of your screen, what you see there is the results of a study done by an IT analyst firm called Wikibon. And what they found was this growth in demand for video surveillance is leading to just absolutely massive new data generation. In fact, video surveillance is now, by far and away, by a factor of almost 2, the largest big data application in the world. This says that video surveillance will generate almost twice as much new data on an annual basis than the next closest application out there. And what's more than that is the rate of that data generation is growing at about 42% per year. So this deluge of new data really has significant implications on how you plan and deploy your technology, especially the underlying server, data storage, and network infrastructure. And I can assure you it's absolutely going to grab the attention of your IT department. Now, I want to look real quickly, though, at the broader world of IoT. I told you before that video surveillance is considered a subset or a portion of that IoT industry or that IoT marketplace, and it is. Video surveillance cameras represent about 10% or so, roughly 10% of all of the IoT devices that are being deployed in 2019. But when you dig down further into this, what's interesting there is that same 10% of devices, those video surveillance cameras, actually generate and represent 84% of the data being generated by all of those 1 billion IoT devices out there. And what's more, if you look a little bit further than this, what you see is that video surveillance actually represents 36% of all the data in the world today. Okay, and these numbers were actually developed by IDC and Gartner. And it's just amazing to think about how much data is now being generated by video surveillance cameras. Now, all of this data, we need to do something with it. And we're going to talk here about what organizations are doing with all this data. But as I mentioned before, we worked with ASIS and Security Management to do a survey to help understand how that data is being used. And Scott Briscoe is going to come back now to talk very briefly about how that survey was conducted, and then I'll come back in and tell you about some of the results there.
Sure, thank you, Brandon. So at the end of 2018, in December of 2018 actually, Security Management Magazine and Pivot3 sent a survey to ASIS members and customers. The survey had approximately 20 questions and generated about 475 responses. Demographically, the respondents represented kind of a really good distribution of ASIS members, kind of exactly what we would expect. The overwhelming majority of them are in the security or public safety field. There were a few in other areas, such as IT or facilities. Roughly 1/3 reported that their company size was 10,000 employees or larger. Roughly 1/3 reported 500 to 10,000 employees, and about 1/3 reported fewer than 500. Respondents also reported responsibility for a wide variety of the types of facilities, everything from healthcare and retail to higher education and warehouse facilities. So very much like a lot of the surveys that security management has done in the past, this is a very good distribution that mirrors what we know of the kind of ASIS member and customer database. And now to kind of dig into those details of some of the findings from the survey, I'm going to turn it back over to Brandon.
Okay, thank you, Scott. So I want to take you through a couple of the questions. We're not going to go through all 20 of them, but we pulled out a couple that we thought the results on were fairly interesting. The first one was, for what purpose do you record surveillance video? And I think that the obvious, most common answer here was for deterring crime. And you see that some of the other uses of video were probably fairly obvious to everyone as well: monitoring operations, forensic investigation, etc. But the one that was a little bit surprising to us was this increasing use of video surveillance to improve customer experience. So now looking at how organizations can leverage investments they make in security technology for something other than traditional security uses. If you dig into that a little bit further, what you see here on the right-hand side of your screen is the type of person that was responding to this survey and what was most important to them. And so we broke that down by the security managers and directors, as well as C-level executives, high-level executives from their organizations. And what you see there was very interesting, was by far and away that C-level, high-level executive is the type of person that was really interested in the overall customer experience and how they could leverage video surveillance in those type of ways. The next question we asked is, how important is your video? How would you categorize the impact of downtime or data loss to your organization? Now, of course, everyone that responded said that there was some kind of impact. If downtime or data loss occurs, there would be some kind of impact. And it was about 50-50 on how big that impact was. But again, as you dig down into this a little bit further, what was interesting is that those who are involved in actually making the purchase decisions, and presumably those who stand to be impacted the most by downtime and data loss, have said that this is a very large impact to their organization. So interesting result there. The next question I wanted to share with you is, what are your top video surveillance priorities upcoming? And this one was pretty interesting to us, because my expectation going into this question was that most people would come back with their highest priority is lowering costs, managing complexity, et cetera, et cetera. But interestingly, the number one answer here was improving performance of their systems. Now, I surmise that this is actually due to all those new high-resolution, high-definition cameras that are coming in, which have a significant impact on performance, which we'll talk about later on. So I thought this result was pretty interesting. But if you dig down again a little bit further, what you find is over the next 12 months, are you looking to upgrade any components of your video surveillance system? And a large majority of organizations are going to continue to invest in and deploy new cameras. And this problem is just going to exacerbate the challenge that we're seeing with performance of those systems. We asked about data storage and retention. How are you currently storing and managing your video data? Not a big surprise on the results here. The vast majority of people are using NVRs, network video recorders, versus an enterprise storage solution like a SAN or a NAS. That's fairly expected result. A little bit interesting was the amount of people still using DVRs. recording analog cameras, which we would anticipate would probably soon be upgraded to IP and digital cameras in the near future. But what was interesting about this, we asked, how long do you typically retain your video? And the result of that was interesting. 63% of respondents said that they now keep their video for more than 30 days. Now, I don't have the exact historic data to go back and compare this to, but I would bet, I would be willing to bet that 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, that percentage of organizations storing their video for more than 30 days was significantly less than what it is today. So you're seeing lots of new data being generated, and you're seeing that data being stored for longer and longer periods of time. Now, the last one I wanted to show you, because this is certainly on the minds of a lot of people now, do you currently use or are you investigating the cloud for video data storage? And I would say probably the results here are also not too surprising. A pretty small contingent of organizations are currently using the cloud. We have another one-third or so of them that are investigating and considering using the cloud. It would be interesting to see how many of that 29% actually end up using the cloud once they get through their investigations. And then the largest group that's really not using the cloud. And so we wanted to look a little bit deeper and say, for those who are not using it today or just still investigating the cloud, why aren't you using it? And this part was kind of interesting because, again, I would say just a year or two, maybe even as recently as last year, the most common answer to this question would likely have been bandwidth and cost. Bandwidth, we all know moving video to the cloud takes a lot of bandwidth, and we know that it can be very expensive. But what was really interesting was the biggest concern by far that was shown was security of that data. And I think a lot of that has probably been driven by some of the high-profile issues that have occurred out there with some of the cloud providers. So security of that data has been a big concern. So what are some of the takeaways from this? Well, we know, as we said, organizations are generating much more video surveillance data than ever before, and that's growing at an exponential rate. We also know that that data is much more important to those organizations than ever before because they're using it for more than just the traditional catch the bad guy type of scenario. And what we found was that organizations are struggling with the technology that is available to them to help them manage it. So I want to take a couple of minutes now and talk through what are the implications of these results that we've seen, and what are some of the technologies available to you today, and what's coming down the pike for you as well. So as we've talked about a little bit, and I'm sure that this audience is very much familiar with, we know that the risk environment for us hasn't necessarily changed very much. The things that we are trying to protect against, the people, property, assets, intellectual property, the brand, etc., hasn't necessarily changed very much, but the threats against those risks absolutely have. And as we have seen and demonstrated, organizations are increasingly turning to new types of technologies to help mitigate those threats. And as we said, all of this new technology is generating huge amounts of data, and this data is more important to us than ever before. Therefore, zero tolerance for downtime and data loss. But we need to also remember that all of this has a major implication on how you select your physical security and video surveillance technology, particularly the underlying server, storage, and networking infrastructure. And you need to look for things that can deliver performance, resiliency, and scalability. And we're going to talk as we go through this about what those mean and why those things are so important to us. But because of all this change, because of this new technology, because of this new data generation, what we are seeing, and I think what you are probably experiencing, is that the traditional model of a security department purchasing, deploying, and managing their security technology alone and in a silo and by themselves is really changing. We're starting to see at least the infrastructure piece of that increasingly move towards the IT departments and become the responsibility of the IT departments. And IT departments bring with them different mindsets, different needs, and different expectations when it comes to their technology. And those differences between security and IT can often cause conflict between those organizations internally. You know, as IT increasingly gets involved in these physical security technologies, often, more and more often, these organizations are working together to select and deploy technology. But we need to understand that while IT certainly shares the same goals as us in the security world, their expectations can be different and can really generate a lot of this conflict. So let's talk a little bit about what those needs and expectations are. First of all, the security department on the left-hand side, when it comes to selecting and deploying technology, the things that they tend to be concerned about, the things that you tend to be concerned about, preventing downtime and data loss, of course, controlling costs, but also looking at things like ensuring our systems are open and non-proprietary, ensuring that they're highly reliable, that they're simple to manage without advanced degrees or PhDs in IT technology. And of course, we're concerned about physical security. Ultimately, our goal is to help our organizations manage risk. That's what we're here for. Well, while IT certainly shares some of the same goals some of the same needs when it comes to technology, they're concerned about downtime and data loss and controlling costs, of course, just like you are. Some of these needs begin to change and they begin to diverge a little bit. They look for things like vendor familiarity or something called workload consolidation, which is a real big buzzword and trend in the IT world. Integration into their management tools, the ones that they use on a daily basis and are very familiar with. And of course, probably the biggest concern, the things that keep IT managers up at night, is security of the data itself. So while an IT department is ultimately out to help you accomplish the same thing, the thing that they are mostly concerned about on a day-in, day-out basis is, how do I manage complexity of all this technology? Remember, they're also responsible for providing infrastructure, hosting infrastructure for all the other technologies in that organization as well. So this can lead to conflict, and conflict with IT is really a recipe for disaster. And the question is, how do we resolve this kind of conflict? And the first thing I'll tell you is, you as the security professional really need to ensure that you play the role of educator. Now, most people on this call, I assume, come from the security world, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can educate our IT counterparts in our organizations to ensure that we are collaborating properly with them and all of us are achieving our goals. I'm going to give you some tools here that you can use to take back to your daily life, and can actually use to educate your IT counterparts. And I'm going to give you some things to consider as well. But the first thing that IT needs to understand is that video surveillance is different. It's different from all the other applications that they're familiar with and all the other applications and workloads that they may host in their data center. And because of that, traditional technology infrastructure technology solutions that they use tend to be suboptimal. They tend to not work very well for video surveillance and other physical security technologies. However, there are some new emerging trends in the IT world that can be leveraged in a way that can help us both achieve all of our goals, which is reducing risk and reducing cost and complexity, and ultimately can help make the lives of the IT person much easier. A little bit of teaser there. I'm going to come back and talk about what some of those technologies are in just a second. But first, I want to arm you with some of the things that you'll need to help educate your IT counterparts. I told you that video surveillance is different. Well, why is video different, and why should your IT department care about this? I also told you before that when you consider technologies for infrastructure, you need to think about three things: performance, resiliency, and scalability. So I want to talk a little bit about each one of those and why each one of those are so important. First of all, performance. When I say performance, what I mean is the infrastructure's ability to take in or to ingest all of that video surveillance data that's being generated now without any kind of loss. Now, video surveillance is interesting. It's very different than any other application in the data center. We are constantly writing data to a disk. 99% of the time, we are bombarding our infrastructure with new data that has to be captured and stored. And that data can be highly variable. In fact, the more activity happening in a camera, the more activity happening in a scene, the more data that's being generated by that camera. Well, that combination of constant writes and highly variable data can often overwhelm a traditional storage system's ability to ingest that data without loss. And that leads to something called frame loss. And frame loss is a really bad thing in video surveillance. It leads to either degradation of the quality of the image, or it can lead to the loss of entire segments of video, effectively rendering all this money that you just invested in your high-resolution video surveillance systems ineffective at best. So performance is a very important topic to consider. Secondly is resiliency. When I say resilience, I mean protection against downtime and data loss. These are mission-critical systems. We cannot tolerate downtime and data loss. But believe it or not, hardware that's used in video surveillance is actually about 3 times more likely to fail when it's used for video surveillance versus when it's used for other applications. And that's because of those challenges that I just told you about. Now, most IT departments will say, look, we have all kinds of great technologies to protect our systems against downtime and data loss. We've spent thousands or millions of dollars on all this great technology to prevent that kind of stuff. And my response to that is, well, yes, we understand that. However, most of those solutions that you have invested in can be prohibitively expensive, or in the worst case, they just don't work for video surveillance. Replicating video data is outrageously expensive. Things like snapshots and even traditional data backup, in many cases, do not work. You cannot use them for video surveillance systems. They don't work. If something fails and you try to recover all that data back, it won't synchronize properly. It will not work. The cloud, as we mentioned before, can be prohibitively expensive. Even older technologies like RAID, which was developed back in the 1970s, believe it or not, really doesn't work very well for video surveillance. And if you're ever interested in the details of why that is, let me know, and I'll be happy to take you into that. But so we need to think about different ways of protecting our systems against downtime and data loss when hardware failures occur. And the last one is scalability. Scalability. One of the worst kept secrets in the video surveillance world is that video surveillance systems never get smaller, and they almost always get bigger. And there's lots of different reasons that video surveillance systems get bigger. We could be adding new cameras, we could be updating technology, new budgets available, whatever. Over time, these systems almost always get larger. But there's a pretty common misperception out there that as your video surveillance system gets larger, you simply have to scale storage capacity to keep up. And that's not true. While you do have to scale storage, you also have to scale your compute and your bandwidth capacity, typically linearly, meaning together, and always in a way that's not disruptive to the operation of your existing systems. So we have to think about different ways to scale, because most infrastructure technology is not designed to scale in that kind of manner. Now, let's take a look at some of the options you have available to you today, and then I want to also take a look at some of the emerging technologies that you have available and do a little bit of a compare and contrast for you here. The most common architecture, infrastructure architecture in video surveillance, as we saw before in our survey, is what's known as the network video recorder, or the NVR. NVR is nothing but an off-the-shelf server combined with video management software and deployed as an appliance, typically. Now, what's interesting is NVRs actually came to be because they were designed to look, act, and feel like older VCRs and later DVRs. And we as an industry really wanted to replicate that experience of buying a box, plugging in a camera, pushing record, and having everything just work. However, when the technology, the camera technology changed from analog to digital, the underlying infrastructure changed as well, or the needs for that infrastructure changed as well. But NVR technology didn't necessarily keep up. And as a result of that, as our systems have gotten larger, as we've gotten to higher and higher resolution cameras, so much more data is being generated, NVRs can really pose problems for some of the larger systems out there. Now, NVRs can work very well. Don't get me wrong. NVRs can work very well for smaller systems. Think about less than 50, 60, maybe 70 cameras or so. NVRs can work very well. As those systems get larger, though, there's a lot of challenges with it. It can lead to really unreliable performance and, more importantly, unreliable retention times. It's very, very difficult to properly size a group of NVRs to capture and retain all of that video. Perhaps more importantly is that NVRs represent single points of failure and really provide a very poor level of data protection. As you get into very large systems where you have dozens of NVRs stacked on top of each other, it can be very difficult to manage and certainly to scale. By its nature, NVRs, you can't make an NVR any bigger than it currently is. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the enterprise storage. And this is what most of your IT counterparts will be very familiar with. Enterprise storage is nothing more than an application server, either a physical or virtual application server, combined together with some kind of shared storage technology, like a SAN or a NAS you may have heard of. And most IT departments have gone to this kind of architecture in their data centers, really because of the antiquated nature of the standard standalone server architecture like NVRs use. And this can solve many of the challenges that NVRs present. It can eliminate those retention challenges. It can eliminate at least some of the single points of failure. The problems that arise with this type of architecture are that, first of all, these systems were designed for that general purpose IT application that is rarely writing data to a disk and is almost always reading data from a disk. And as a result of that, these systems tend to perform very poorly for video surveillance applications. And that leads to those challenges with frame loss and image degradation and video loss, like I mentioned before. But in addition to that, these kinds of technologies tend to be very big, very expensive, built on proprietary single-purpose hardware, and really require a significant amount of specialized expertise to manage on a day-in and day-out basis. So while this is certainly another option you have available to you, it doesn't necessarily meet all of the needs that both the security and the IT departments have when it comes to managing and deploying infrastructure. Now, what's interesting is that there's some changes happening in the IT world, and I want to talk for just a second about one trend in particular, because I think it's going to have a direct implication, or could have a direct implication, into how you think about deploying infrastructure for video surveillance. A few years ago, like most functions, IT organizations began looking at ways to reduce costs, reduce complexity, They started taking a very hard look at their data centers, and what they found was that these data centers were actually massive cost centers for them. So they needed a way to, how can they reduce the cost and complexity of those data centers? Well, some of the big major technology innovators, some of them you see on the screen here, you're probably very familiar with who these companies are, came up with ways to eliminate all of the big, expensive, proprietary hardware that their data centers were made up of, and vastly reduce the cost and complexity of those data centers by effectively building their own infrastructure based on low-cost, standard, off-the-shelf commodity hardware and specialized software that can replicate the capabilities of that big, expensive proprietary hardware. And that's great for companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google. They probably have thousands of IT people each that work in their organizations, and they have the money that they can go out and invest in technology like this. Most organizations don't have the ability to do this on their own. So a new category of infrastructure technology has emerged called hyperconverged infrastructure that intends to bring the value and capability that companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google have already realized to everyone else, every other organization out there as well. So hyperconverged infrastructure, otherwise known as HCI, can help you solve a number of the challenges that we have just talked about for your large-scale, mission-critical video surveillance and physical security systems without the cost and complexity typically associated with this high-level enterprise-class infrastructure. Now, I don't want to get too technical. That's not the purpose of today's discussion. But if you look at the image on the left-hand side of your screen, what you'll see is that hyperconverged infrastructure really takes the best of both worlds of the NVR and the enterprise storage. It starts with the same low-cost, off-the-shelf hardware, server hardware, commodity server hardware that, in many cases, the same hardware that NVRs use, typically deployed in clusters or groups of those servers together. And then it uses some specialized software that turns those clusters into enterprise-class infrastructure that can be specifically tuned and optimized for a video surveillance application. Now, again, I'm not going to go deep into the technology here, but if you notice, some of the benefits that hyperconverged infrastructure can typically bring are listed on the right-hand side of the screen. The typical benefits of hyperconverged will be much higher levels of resiliency that enable you to eliminate downtime and data loss. They can, even when major hardware failures occur. That's one of the biggest benefits of hyperconverged is if a major hardware failure occurs, you ensure that your systems are online, they're operational, you always have access to your previously recorded video, and everything continues to work. Additionally, they can be tuned and optimized for a video surveillance application and perform properly for video surveillance, and then sustain that performance again, even when major hardware failures occur. That leads to preventing frame drops, eliminating problems that most infrastructure deals with modern, high-resolution, high-definition video surveillance cameras. The nature of its architecture makes it highly scalable, enables you to start small, start with relatively small systems, and then as your needs change over time, by simply adding nodes or adding boxes into that cluster, you can scale storage, compute, and bandwidth for the entire cluster, and you can do it in a way that's non-disruptive. It doesn't disrupt the operation of your existing systems. Hyperconverged infrastructure leverages server virtualization technology, which allows you to consolidate multiple different applications from multiple different servers together onto one common infrastructure. So while video surveillance tends to be the application that's the most challenging for infrastructure to manage. Many organizations are deploying hyperconverged infrastructure for video and then extending that infrastructure for all their other physical security applications as well. Access control, video analytics, visitor management, building management, PSIM, all the various different types of systems that you might deploy can be consolidated together in that hyperconverged infrastructure, and you can bring the benefits of all of that resiliency and performance and scalability now to your entire physical security suite. And the great part is that because it's low-cost, off-the-shelf commodity server hardware that gets its value through software, you can deliver all of this capability, all of this value without the cost and complexity typically associated with enterprise class infrastructure and technologies. Now, hyperconverged by its nature is open and non-proprietary. There is typically no integration, there's no engineering required for software to run in a hyperconverged environment, and the vast majority of video management software providers and increasingly of video analytics providers, as well as access control and all the other different systems out there, the vast majority of them support hyperconverged infrastructure today out of the box without any kind of changes required. So you can be sure that as you select and deploy hyperconverged infrastructure, that it will work with the software that you have selected, perhaps separately. Now, all this is great, but you're probably asking now, well, this all sounds great. Sounds like really great technology, but what is the real so what? What is the impact back to my business or my organization? What is the true value that all of this resiliency, performance, scalability, workload consolidation, all that stuff, what does it actually deliver to me, or what can it deliver to me? And it's actually pretty straightforward. Better resiliency helps you reduce risk. It helps you reduce risk that may be introduced by your technology itself. Preventing downtime and data loss that can result from hardware failures introduces risk to your organization. Hyperconverged infrastructure can help you reduce and eliminate that risk. The higher levels of performance means that you maximize the effectiveness of your video surveillance and your physical security systems and protect that investment that you've made in them. Meaning they will work the way you need them, the way you expect them to, when you need them to. And then, of course, consolidating those workloads, simplifying the management, all that comes back to reducing your cost, reducing your complexity, lowering the total cost of ownership, but also, as we talked about before, meeting the needs and the expectations that your IT departments are bringing to you today. So hyperconverged infrastructure offers you significant opportunities to improve on these mission-critical systems, the investments you're making in these mission-critical technologies to help you run your business, to help you run your organization, to ensure that you are delivering the kind of service to the rest of your organization that you expect. Okay, with that being said, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to take us through too many real-world examples, but I'm going to quickly go over a couple of them here, and I think that we will make these slides available to you so you will have the ability to read into this perhaps a little bit deeper. But I want to quickly just talk about 2 or 3 real-world examples of how hyperconverged technology has been deployed to help deliver some of this value that we just mentioned. The first one is the University of Central Florida in Orlando. The situation there, University of Central Florida is, believe it or not, I didn't know this, believe it or not, but they are the second largest university in the country by enrollment. And a few years ago, they had an active shooter situation on campus. And what was interesting and potentially tragic, but turned out to be okay, this active shooter had free run of the campus, and their public safety department, their public safety organization did have access to video surveillance cameras around the campus to try and locate this guy and respond. But it took them almost 4 hours to access that video. And anyone in the security industry knows 4 hours is about 3 hours and 59 minutes and 59 seconds too long, right, in that kind of situation. So luckily, this person's gun jammed, and he didn't do any harm to anyone other than himself. But after that event happened, the public safety department got together with their counterparts in IT as well as the newly formed emergency management department and took a look at all their different technologies. What they found was really staggering. They found they had 58 separate standalone systems spread across their campus in Orlando with 12,000 different points, different sensors out there, and none of them working together. So they ultimately elected to invest in a couple of initiatives. One of them, though, was HyperConverged Infrastructure that enabled them to consolidate all of those different systems together into one and give them the level of performance and resilience that they needed to ensure that video would always be available and always be accessible to them. So this is one instance of how HyperConverged is used in a very large, very high-profile environment, and security technology quickly became very mission-critical. A very different kind of deployment was FedEx, and in fact, specifically FedEx Ground. FedEx has about over 1,000 now, I think, warehouse and distribution facilities across the U.S. That are relatively small from a security standpoint, 30 to 50 cameras in each site. The challenge that FedEx had was they needed to continually deploy new technology without any kind of IT or security person available on site. So they had to manage systems at 1,000 different locations without anybody locally to do that, including the infrastructure, not just the video management software, but the infrastructure as well. So they leveraged HyperConverged Infrastructure to jump ahead here. They were able to leverage HyperConverged Infrastructure to significantly reduce the cost or the time that it took them to deploy new systems and new locations from 2 to 3 days down to 2 to 3 hours. And it gave them the ability to centrally manage and centrally access all of those systems, every part of those systems remotely from any location without having to send a person physically out to the site. And then the last one I want to talk about is Iron Mountain. Many of you may know Iron Mountain, certainly know this name. Iron Mountain's been around for a long, long time. They have been in the record retention and destruction business for a long period of time. Many of you maybe even used Iron Mountain for things like shredding or for offsite file storage and things like that. A few years ago, Iron Mountain recognized that their capability in protecting and storing information could be extended to the digital world. And so they built out something called the Iron Cloud, which is effectively a remote data center or a series of remote data centers out there that are built literally into mountains, underneath mountains, and can deliver a very, very high level of resiliency to their clients, to their customers, to help them store and protect their digital data. Well, just about 2 years ago, Iron Mountain decided they're doing all of this storage for general IT data, but they haven't been doing it for video surveillance. And so they decided to build out an offering called the Iron Cloud for video that have all the same kind of capabilities that their standard Iron Cloud solution had, but optimized for video surveillance. So enabling organizations to store video surveillance data off-site for long periods of time in a highly resilient location. So ultimately, they turned to HyperConverged Infrastructure to help them actually launch a new service to their customers and to their clients. To them now, this data is not just their own. This is their customers' data. This is other people's data. So resiliency was of the utmost importance and the utmost criticality to them, as was scalability. Because they are actually offering this as a service, this is something that will certainly change and evolve over time. So be happy to provide you more detail into each one of these case studies and some of the challenges and benefits that they were able to recognize from this. But in the interest of time now, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to turn it back over to Scott, and I'm going to see if we have any questions out there that have come in.
Thank you, Brandon. So yeah, we have some questions coming in, and I just want to reiterate that if any of you do have questions for Brandon, while we have his great expertise here on the line, feel free to write the question in your question box off to your left on your screen. And to give Brandon a quick break to have a drink of water or something, the first two questions I'll be answering. First one is just as Brandon alluded to before, people were asking about slides for the presentation. On your screen, you should see a resource box, and that has copies of the slides. It also has a great solution brief from Pivot3 on video surveillance solutions. There's also a white paper on results from the survey study that Brandon was talking about earlier. And so be sure to kind of utilize the resources in that box. Another question that we had was going back to kind of specifically one of the questions in our survey on video storage. Someone noted that several people had chosen other as a category and asking what falls under other. And it looks like about 6% had chosen other in terms of their how they were storing their video. That equates to about 30 people or so, so don't think this is huge numbers or anything. And I just quickly went and looked of the people who wrote in comments, well more than half of them wrote in the word cloud or something related to cloud. So that's the bulk of those people. The rest of them, just taking a quick look at the descriptions, I would say they were describing something that is most akin to either NVR or enterprise or some combination of those systems. And with that, I wanted to ask Brandon, is there who typically provides hardware for large video deployments? Is it the IT? Is it the security integrator? Where does the hardware come from for those things?
Well, what we have seen is that it can come from a couple of different sources. You know, I think just a few years ago, it was most common that everything in a system came from a security integrator. And I think that largely is still the case in most situations. Occasionally we are seeing that some IT departments decide that they want to go and buy infrastructure technology from whatever vendor or channels that they normally buy the rest of their IT infrastructure from. But that's less common. However, what we are definitely seeing is IT departments involved in the decision making. So even if the technology is being purchased from a security integrator, it typically has to meet the requirements of the IT department, because they're the ones that tend to actually have to manage it on a day in, day out basis.
All right, great. So we're getting a couple of questions about Pivot3 technology specifically. One just asking kind of what is the software or hardware provided by Pivot3, and then another question is, can the Pivot3 solution be managed by the IT department using their normal system management tools? I'll let you answer both of those.
Okay, the first one is what is the software?
Yeah, it's kind of just describe the HCI software that Pivot3 offers, and then also what is the hardware related to that?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. In terms of the Pivot3 technology specifically, We use hardware, standard x86 server hardware. Our hardware comes from either Lenovo, Dell, or Supermicro. So we do not make hardware. There's nothing custom about the hardware that we use. It does have some specific build requirements, but there's nothing special or proprietary or custom about it. Our software, we do make hyperconverged software. It's called Acuity. And in fact, we have a version of it called Acuity Surveillance Edition that's built specifically for video surveillance, obviously. And then we also leverage software, server virtualization software from VMware called ESXi. But there's a tight integration there between the Pivot3 software and the VMware software. And typically with the way that we do it is we deploy all of that software together as a turnkey or combined solution, either with or typically with the hardware. Sometimes the hardware is provided by someone else, but typically together with the hardware. And then the second question was, about managing. Yeah, so oftentimes IT departments manage all of this infrastructure themselves. We actually, in terms of Pivot3, now all of the vendors do things a little bit differently here, but I can talk to how Pivot3 does it and how I would say many IT departments prefer it. We actually offer two different ways to manage this environment. One is we provide a free piece of software ourselves called Acuity Manager that is just installed on a workstation somewhere and can be used to manage all of the storage and the servers and everything together from a single pane of glass. But what many IT departments prefer is to use their investment that they've made in a management tool called vCenter. If they assuming that they use VMware in other parts of their data center, they use a tool called vCenter. And we have actually developed a plugin directly to vCenter that allows an IT department then to manage an entire Pivot3 infrastructure through their existing tools that they're familiar with, that they use on a day-in, day-out basis. So it can be done either way. There's not really a difference in terms of functionality or anything like that. There's no cost to either of them. But we found that most of our IT centric clients of ours tend to prefer that vCenter plugin.
Great. So somebody is saying that they are seeing some demand for closed cloud-based surveillance systems, and is asking kind of what are your feelings about that?
Yeah.
They gave the example of Verkada.
Verkada, yeah. You know, look, my stance on the cloud is that the cloud will absolutely play a role in video surveillance and physical security in the future. It's starting to play a role now. I would say it's still somewhat niche today in the sense that it tends to fit pretty well for, smaller systems. If you have a situation where you've got a large system, with hundreds of cameras or thousands of cameras, and or if you're a public or a quasi-public organization like a government organization or an airport or something like that, you may have some challenges with using the cloud as a whole across your entire system. Just the cost and the technical hurdles of streaming that much video onto the internet can be real challenging. It can work pretty well for smaller systems. But what I think is really going to happen over the next couple of years is you're going to start to see the disaggregation, particularly of the software. And what I mean by that is today, a lot of video management software is pretty monolithic. It's sort of everything is big. All the capabilities of that system are kind of forced together under one big umbrella. And you as an end user may not be that familiar with it. you're going to start to see some of the modularization and disaggregation of that, where we can start to pull pieces and parts of that software out and move those parts that are more applicable up to the cloud while maintaining some of that capability within or on-prem, as on-premise, as you would call it today. So for example, you may see some things like data storage remain on-premise because it's just too challenging to move all that data off-site. But maybe we can move some of our analytics functions up to the cloud, or maybe we can move, many of VMS companies have management servers, or maybe we can move the client side of that up to the cloud. So I think you're going to start to see a lot of different pieces, parts, and components of the systems move to the cloud. I don't think you're going to see on a large scale entire video environments, entire video systems collectively all going up to the cloud at any one point in time. That may happen eventually, but I just don't see it being a large scale thing in the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, great. And with that, we are at time for the webinar. I want to thank Pivot3 and Brandon for this truly great session on video surveillance trends and where we're going. I'm sure that we all appreciate the time and effort that you've spent putting this presentation together. And with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today and wish you a great afternoon. Goodbye.